Hello everyone, Lane Ridenauer here for our combined Sunday school classes from First Presbyterian Church here in Greensboro. As always, we're delighted to have you with us as we gather together virtually to worship God. Danny Massie will be along in just a few moments with part 2 of his 3-part series on the book of Ruth. But first up, we'll be singing a hymn together, and the hymn today is All Hail the Power of Jesus' Name, sometimes referred to as the national anthem of Christianity. The song was written back in the 1790s, the text by Edward Perronet, who was the son of an Anglican minister. He was later associated with the ministry of John and Charles Wesley of Methodist fame. And over the years, the tune that we've associated with it, there are over 3 tunes that are regularly used with the song. The one we use here in the United States was written by Oliver Holden, who was a carpenter by trade, but he also was a church musician and choir director at the First Baptist Church in Boston, Massachusetts. Regardless of the different versions of text or the different tunes, I think we'll all agree that this hymn points out that every kindred, every tribe, from the chosen seed to the sinners to the martyrs, will all sing together the everlasting song at the feet of Jesus. I'll put the words up on the screen for you and invite you to sing along with All Hail the Power of Jesus' Name. All hail the power of Jesus' name, let angels prostrate fall. Bring forth the royal diadem and crown him Lord of all. Bring forth the royal diadem and crown him Lord of all. Ye chosen seed of Israel's race, ye ransomed from the fall. Hail him who saves you by his grace, and crown him Lord of all. Hail him who saves you by his grace, and crown him Lord of all. Let every kindred, every tribe on this terrestrial ball to him all majesty ascribe, and crown him Lord of all. To him all majesty ascribe, and crown him Lord of all. Oh, that with yonder sacred throng we at his feet may fall. We'll join the everlasting song and crown him Lord of all. We'll join the everlasting song and crown him Lord of all.
Hello. I'm removing my mask. I hope all of you are keeping your mask on and being safe during this time of pandemic. My name is Danny Massie, and for those of you who've joined us, this is the Sunday school class for the Young Men's Bible Study and the AGAPE class on the 16th of August. But you may be tuning in at a different time for this, so we welcome you whether you're a member of the church or not. We're in the process of studying the book of Ruth, and last time together we looked at chapter 1. Today we're going to hopefully finish chapter 2, and then in 2 weeks we'll come back and conclude this study with the 3rd chapter of the book of Ruth. A wonderful story, one of the world's best short stories, it has been called. And let me just remind you of what happened in chapter 1, so you have the context for what continues here. Naomi was a Jewish woman married to a man by the name of Elimelech, also Jewish, and there was a famine in the land of Canaan, and they had to move. It was in the time of the Judges. That was an awful time for Israel. because there was no king in the land, and the book itself, the last of Joshua says, in the time of judges, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And it was a time where you can follow the lives of all of the judges, and you'll have 5 S's. They sinned, they were enslaved, there was supplication, they cried out to the Lord for deliverance. The Lord sent a salvation in the form of one of these judges that he raised up, and then there was a time of silence, and then it repeated itself throughout the book of Judges. Sin, slavery, supplication, a Savior is raised, salvation, and then silence. And so that's the cyclical nature of history in the book of Judges. The interesting thing is that this book of Ruth is set in the time of the Judges, but in contrast to that view of the time, in this book, everyone acts lovingly and faithfully and responsibly. There are no bad actors, there are no bad characters in the book of Ruth. Everyone lives as a servant of God and acts appropriately for that position. So the story begins in chapter 1 with a famine comes to the land, and Elimelech and Naomi have to decide what are they going to do. They have 2 boys, Mahlon and Chilion, and they have no food. So they decide they will immigrate to the land of Moab, which had historically been one of their enemies, but there was food in Moab, and so they moved their family to Moab, and things really went from bad to worse. They had food to eat, but Elimelech died soon after they arrived there, and ultimately both of Naomi's sons, Mahlon and Chilion, died as well. So every male in her life was lost. She had no one, and that was a particularly tragic circumstance for a widow or a woman back in those ages, because they were so dependent on either their husbands, their fathers, or their sons to provide for them. So she had no security. She felt she had no future. So she decides that she will move back to where she came from in Bethlehem. So this is in Bethlehem before Jesus, but it's also a story of the epiphany, the revelation of God that takes place there before the birth of Jesus. So the good thing that did happen when they were in the land of Moab is that Chilion and Mahlon had both married Moabite women who were really wonderful people, Ruth and Orpah. And so they decide that they will go with Naomi back to her land. And she tries to talk them out of this. She said, no, I'm old, I'm too old to have children. I'm not going to have any more children in all probability, and you wouldn't wait to marry them if I had them. So go back to your people, go back to your family's homes, find husbands there, and have a wonderful life there. You don't have to come with me. Well, Orpah decided that she would go back, but Ruth said, no, I'm not going back. I'm not going to leave you. Where you go, I'll go. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. And where you're buried, I'll be buried. So Ruth accompanies Naomi back to Bethlehem. And so when we get to the end of chapter 1, we read that it was the beginning of the barley harvest. Now that is a significant thing because they had no food. So they're going back to Bethlehem at a time when there's going to be a good harvest and people are just beginning to harvest the field. So it was, you could say it was fortuitous or it was lucky, but what I'm saying and what I think the book is teaching is that it's providential. God is taking care of these women who are acting in faith and in obedience, and the whole book is about the providence of God and how we can see it in the ordinary events and circumstances of our lives, not just in the big events, but in the little events as well. And so that's kind of where we left off. They have arrived in Bethlehem. We're told that people are stirred by the arrival of Naomi. Apparently they still remember Naomi because she was from there. But she tells them that she went away full, she has come back empty. The writer plays on these words. And she said, don't call me Naomi. Naomi means pleasant, but call me Mara because Mara means bitter. And she says, God has acted and I have a bitter life now. Interesting, she never lost her faith. She kept her faith and she believed in the worst of times and in the best of times, the hand of God was on her. And that just reveals her faith, I think, which is, of course, worthy of our emulation. So I'm going to read now the first 7 verses of chapter 2. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. That's just reminding you, this is her dead husband's relative, and she happens to go to his field. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his young men who were in charge of the reapers, Whose young woman is this?" And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. So the reapers report to Boaz who this woman is that he's never seen before, out in the fields, working hard from early morning till late in the day, taking only a short rest. Now, one of the things that's fascinating about this book in a literary sense is that the reader, or originally the listener, is given clues about what's going on that even the actors, even the prominent characters are not aware of. We know things when we read this that Naomi and Ruth did not know. It's not a mystery story. If you like reading mysteries, usually you get to reading a detective novel or a mystery, you get to the end of the book, the end of the story, and it all begins to fall into place. Here's a guy that was murdered. You're trying to solve the murder, and you get to the end of the murder mystery, and all of a sudden you discover the butler did it. But why did the butler do it? Well, you find out at the end of the book that he is the son of a business partner of the deceased man, and this business partner was cheated out of his wealth. So this is the son trying to get revenge. But you don't know that when you're reading the mystery. It all comes out at the end. Not so in the story of Ruth. We know even what Ruth and Naomi and Boaz are not aware of. We're given clues that God is at work here beyond what appears to be happening on the surface. There's something more going on. And so there are clues throughout this book that indicate that. And that just is a reminder, I think, if you study biblical literature, that the people that wrote this were gifted in a literary sense, not just as people of faith, but they had the talent to tell a story in such a way that it was memorable and effective. So, at any rate, we realize that behind all of the things that seem just ordinary, customary events, there's famine in the land, you have to look for a job, you have to look for food, you have a death in your family. God is involved in all of this. It's not to say that God sends it, but God can use it in His plan to bless His people and to help others. So it's not coincidental. You could say some of these things just coincidentally happen. They just happened onto the land that was owned by a relative of their husband and their, both of their husbands. But it wasn't happenstance. It was the hand of God at work. And they won't realize this until later. And it's just like in our lives. We go through challenges and circumstances we're not aware of how God is using this. But one day we may look back and see how it was used to bless us when we were not aware of it at the time. That's what this book is teaching, and I think we can really learn from it. You've probably heard a saying that the devil is in the details. Well, the divine is in the details too. When you look at the details of this story and the circumstances of their lives, you realize how God is at work in ways they can't understand or see to bless their lives and to care for them. So Ruth asked permission. It says something about her character. She asked permission from Naomi, can I go out to the fields and gather some grain for us to eat? It says something of her character, I think, that she doesn't want to do anything that's going to jeopardize their position in this land that is a foreign land for her. She's from Moabite. She's back in the land of Ephrathah, in the area of Bethlehem. And so she wants to always act in a way that won't upset Naomi or get Naomi into any trouble. So she asks permission, and then even when she gets into the field, she asks permission from the reapers if she can glean in that field. And we'll look at gleaning in a few minutes. But like in verse 3, it says in the New Revised Standard Version, as it happened, Ruth came to the field belonging to Boaz. Or it just so happened. So all of these things that you see in the book where it says, it just so happened. Well, it didn't just happen. It was God at work behind the scenes. The old King James Version of the Bible, I like the way it expresses it. It says, and she went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and her hap was to light on a field belonging to Boaz, who was a kindred of Elimelech, in case you forgot in the story. So it was her hap, or it was happenstance, we might say today. But not so. It was the hand of God at work. And some of these things that we call coincidences are simply God acting anonymously. And we don't realize it at the time. But later we may live to understand how it was. So gleaning was a part of the law of Moses. It was not just a suggestion to the people. It was something that was required of them. If they were going to be faithful to their God, gleaning was required of those who farm. And you can read about this in the book of Deuteronomy in the 24th chapter. Let me just read verses 19 through 22 in Deuteronomy 24. It says, when you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back and get it. It shall be for the alien, the orphan, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all your undertakings. When you beat your olive trees, do not strip what is left. It shall be left for the alien, the orphan, and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, do not glean what is left. It shall be for the alien, the orphan, and the widow. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore I am commanding you to do this. Don't forget where you come from. Don't forget how I have blessed you, and you are to be a blessing to others. So don't gather all your harvest. You have to leave it. And you especially have to leave it for the poor, and the widow, and the orphan, and those who are indigent and in need, the sojourner among you. I think this hits us as people of faith, Jewish and Christian. Just reminds us that God has a vested interest, not simply in what we believe, but in how we live in community with others. How do we treat the foreigner among ourselves? How do we deal with immigrants? How do we deal with the poor and the dispossessed? It is a part of our duty to God to exercise our duty to the neighbor. We have to provide for them as well. If we expect to be blessed, that will be the source of our blessing. So when people tell me, oh, the church doesn't need to get involved in anything having to do with tax policies or agricultural policies or health issues in the community, that's not according to the scriptures. God is interested in that, and we're to be interested in that. And what we are instructed by God to do and to be ought to affect how we work in society to make sure that everyone is cared for. We say it takes a village to raise a child. Well, it takes a whole community to care for those people in need around us. One of the things I feel best about in this congregation is our Hot Dish and Hope program, where we're feeding people twice a week on Tuesday and Thursday. How we're working with immigrants coming into the community to kind of help them get on their feet and find a position. So that is critically important. That's a part of our life of faith. And we're not doing it just to be do-gooders. We're doing it because God commands us to do it. It's not a suggestion, it's a command. Boaz greets his workers. Notice how he greets his workers. He says to them, the Lord be with you. And they respond, well, the Lord be with you, or the Lord bless you. Now that ought to sound familiar to us. That is something called the dominus vobiscum. We use it in worship today. When we do the passing of the peace, we say, "The Lord be with you," and we respond, "The Lord be with you." Well, this is where it comes from. That's a way that people of faith in ancient times greeted each other. And it says something about Boaz, about his faith and character, I think, that he deals with his employees and his servants in this way. They try to bless each other. So when Boaz first steps on the scene in the Bible, in this drama, he is both dispensing and receiving mercy. And it says something, I believe, about the substance of his character as well. Well, why did he take notice of this young woman, this Moabite woman out in the field? He notices her. He asks the reapers, and they report about her. But what was it that drew him to her? We know that he was considerably older than Ruth. We don't know how much older, but simply that he was much older. But apparently he's taken by this young woman working in the fields. My mother would say he was smitten, I guess. Something about her drew him to her. But what was it? Was it the way she looked? We're not told that. Was it the fact that she was working so hard in the fields? Nothing is said about that in terms of why he was attracted to her. At this point, he's going to say shortly what it was that drew him to her. Was it because of her own faith that she had agreed as a Moabite to embrace the faith of Israel, to serve Yahweh, Naomi's God? Was it her hesed? We'll hear the word hesed. That's a Hebrew word that is played out throughout the Old Testament, especially in this book. H-E-S-E-D, we would spell it in English. But it's loving, loyal kindness, loyal love. You don't give up on someone. You love them forever. It's kind of like agape in the New Testament, sacrificial love. It's you love that person for their welfare, not for what it's going to do for you. Well, there's hesed that's exercised and practiced throughout this book, and here's an instance of it. He sees this woman, this Moabite woman, a foreigner, who's living with hesed because she's caring for her mother-in-law. She didn't have to do that. She's working hard to support the two of them. And so we don't have to speculate that that he had any kind of ulterior motives in being drawn to this young woman, or that it was some kind of love at first sight. It's not saying that. But there was something about her that made him want to care for her and made him want to protect her. And so he does so. This is another illustration, I think, when she decides to go into the field and ask permission to do that even though we rely on the providential blessing of God, we have to make decisions and take actions ourselves. We don't just wait for God to come in and bless us miraculously. We get to work in a way that we can be used by God. I remember I told, I think in a sermon earlier, the story about the two little boys that decided they'd go fishing before they went to school one morning. Well, they got caught up in the fishing and they lost sight of the time. Suddenly they realize they're going to be late for school. So the two of them start running toward the school, and one little boy says, "Let's stop and pray that we won't be late." And the other little boy said, "Let's keep running and pray that we won't be late." I think it's a great illustration. We do our part and God does his part. We don't just sit back and wait for God to come in and deliver us from whatever troubles we're having, but we take the initiative and try to do things for ourselves that God can use. So we bear responsibility, partial responsibility, for what happens to us and to ours in life. And we see examples of that both in Naomi did that in chapter 1, where she took the responsibility of packing up and going first to Moab, and then packing up and leaving Moab to go back to Bethlehem when circumstances required it. So let's move on then to the next verses 8 through 16 in the second chapter of Ruth. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and she said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and your mother and your native land, and you came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Now, she's not only taking refuge under God's wings, she will be taking refuge under the wings of Boaz as well. And then she said, "I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants." And at the mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied. And she had some left over. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some of the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." So here's Boaz doing everything he can to protect this young Moabite, and to make sure that his own men working in the field, and the women that were working in the fields as well, would help her, would give her water when she needed it. She could follow after them. He even instructs them to make sure there's enough for her to gather. And she gathers far more than she and Naomi will need. So he calls her here "my daughter." And you almost get the sense it's more like a parent dealing with a child, or a father dealing with a daughter, than it is a man infatuated with a young woman that he had not seen before. There's nothing in this book to suggest there was anything inappropriate about what Boaz does, or what Naomi or Ruth does, or anyone else in the story. They all, as I said earlier, act in an appropriate way. So she's instructed how she's to glean, and where she's to glean, and the men that are working around her are instructed to protect her and to look out for her. Boaz realizes this could be a dangerous situation. Not only is she young, not only is she a foreigner, and not only is she a widow who has no protection, but she would be an easy victim for assault if someone wanted to assault her. So he's acting out of loyal love to make sure she is protected, and that his other servants know to look after her. So we see in this story God's gracious providence at work in the lives and in the stories of these two women. We can say, I think, even in our lives, that God acts to provide us with protection and with nourishment and with security in the face of danger, and also with opportunities to have meaningful work and labor. All those things we do in a community to make sure that all people have those benefits, that everyone needs the right to have food, to have meaningful labor, to feel secure in their homes or places wherever they live. That's something we all owe to the whole community as people of faith. So those issues too are not secular issues, they're issues of faith and obedience for the people of God. And it's always been so, and it's certainly so in this story, and I believe it's so in our own lives as well. One of the things we see in this book also, it's kind of a new, I hadn't thought of this myself, is we can see something here, the relationship between prayer and providence. Naomi prays. She prays for Orpah and for Ruth when she sends them back to their homes. She prays for their blessing and benefit. And here in this story, the verses we've just heard, Boaz prays for Ruth, that she will be successful in this new land. There is a relationship between prayer and providence. If you don't believe in providence, it doesn't make any sense to pray. If you don't believe that there's a God up there or out there or in there who loves us and acts for our blessing and benefit, then why would you pray? So prayer is an indication that one believes in a God who is active in our daily routine lives and cares about that. Let me just read you a quote. This is from David Atkinson's commentary on the book of Ruth, entitled The Wings of Refuge. And this is what he writes. Prayer is, as it were, the flip side to the doctrine of providence. Prayer is the acknowledgement, not to the psychological benefit of some mythological exercise, but of the fact that we believe that God is there, that God cares, that God rules, that God provides, and we believe it in such a way that we are ready to do something on that basis, namely speak to Him about it. Providence reminds us of our creatureliness and our dependence on God, and that together with all people, we stand under God's lordship. Prayer is an activity by which we acknowledge that we cannot be our own lords. Providence reminds us that everything is not ultimately absurd or meaningless. Rather, prayer is our way of expressing our yes to the conviction that God is working His purposes out in nature, in people, and in history. God is working His purpose out in the lives of Ruth and Naomi. And my friends, God is working His purpose out in our lives as well, whether we can see it at the moment or not. Later, in retrospect, perhaps we will see how this was the case. I told a story when I was teaching on the book of Daniel that when I was younger, getting ready to graduate from high school, I was praying fervently for two things. One, I wanted to get back together with this girl I'd gone with all through high school, and we'd broken up, and I was distressed about that. So I was praying that we could somehow get back together. And then I was praying that I would get this particular scholarship to the college I wanted to attend, Southwestern at Memphis, it was called then, Rhodes College. But I knew the only way I could possibly go to that college was to get one of their top 4 scholarships, which was a full ride. And it wasn't an athletic scholarship, it was an academic and leadership scholarship. Well, I prayed for those things, and nothing seemed to be going in that direction with the girl or with the scholarship. So I said, maybe I'm being greedy. Okay, just one of these, Lord. If you just give me one of these, I'll be happy. Either I get back with the girl or I get the scholarship. As it turned out, neither of those things happened. And in retrospect, I can say with Garth Brooks, thank God for unanswered prayers, because I found someone else that I think was a better match for me and has meant more to my life, I think, than the other relationship would have in time. And also, I didn't get the scholarship. I didn't go to the college that I wanted to go to, but I made it through college, another college, and it was probably where I needed to be because of some lessons and instruction I had there. It's not where I wanted to go, but it must have been where God wanted me to go. So in retrospect, God answered my prayers, but He answered by saying no, and that's what I needed to hear at the time. Now, there's something that happened in the verses we just read that is radical, and I don't know if we even paid attention to it. It doesn't strike us as unusual, but it certainly would have struck people as unusual back then. And that is this Jewish landowner, a man of substance and wealth, a worthy person he's called. The word that is used here can mean rich, it can mean worthy, and in describing Boaz, but he invites Ruth to have a meal with him. They sit down together to eat. Now, in that ancient culture, that didn't happen. To eat with someone was symbolic of the fact that you accept them as an equal. And here again, this isn't some kind of romantic tryst. This is not something inappropriate because the reapers are around them when they're eating together. But it's a way of showing that Boaz accepts this Moabite widow as an equal, that he respects her, that he values her as a person. Now that flies against Middle Eastern culture. It's the same reason why Jesus got in so much trouble, especially in chapters 14 through 16 in the Gospel of Luke, because he eats with sinners. He eats with people that, though the righteous around him thought, well, you're accepting this person as an equal. You know, whether it's a prostitute or a tax collector or whoever. But Jesus would eat with anyone because he accepted all and affirmed them individually. Well, that is what Boaz is doing with Ruth. when he breaks bread, and it's almost like a sacramental meal, because there's bread and wine that they share there in the field of the barley harvest. And I say this was unusual in Middle Eastern culture back then, that a man of Boaz's substance would eat with this foreigner and a female. But that's come down through the ages. It's come down into our own culture between blacks and whites who for many years did not eat together. I just saw for the second or third time the movie The Help that was filmed in Mississippi. And it was about a relationship between this young white woman and this maid who helped raise her named Constantine. The white girl is called Skeeter, and she realizes toward the end of the book that she never sat down and ate with Constantine because it wasn't permitted. African Americans ate separately from white Americans, especially in the Deep South in Mississippi. And this was filmed just right around the corner where my wife lived. And a lot of those scenes are very familiar to us, the drugstore and some of the roads, the subdivision in which Skeeter lived. At any rate, and I think that's one of the reasons why when the fight for racial justice broke out, one of the first things that was done was claiming the right to sit at table. And just down the street here, the sit-ins at Walgreens started much of the civil rights movement. And I think it was realized how important, what this symbolically, this meant if you sit down and eat with someone, then you're of equal status. And so that was so offensive to the white establishment, but it was what had to be done in order to break through these barriers that we had created in our own culture. Well, we'll continue the story of Ruth looking at the 3rd chapter and try to wind it up on the 30th of August. I would like to close by reading a prayer that comes from the Confessions of St. Augustine. And when I read this prayer, I thought of the story that we just looked at from the book of Ruth. So let us close in prayer. O Lord our God, let the shelter of your wings give us hope. Protect us and uphold us. You will be the support that upholds us from childhood till the hair on our head turns gray. When you are our strength, we are strong. But when our strength is our own, we are weak. In you, the good abides forever. And when we turn away from it, we turn to evil. Let us come home at last to you, O Lord, for fear that we be lost. For in you our good abides, and it has no blemish, since it is yourself. Nor do we fear that there is no home to which we can return. We fell from it, but our home is your eternity, and it does not fall because we are away. In the name of Christ our Lord, amen. So come back and join us on the 30th of August, and God bless you.